So welcome, I'm going to be doing a MOAC 7412 exam. This is going to be our lab prep video. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and get 4 Server 2012 R2 servers up and running. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new virtual machine. I'm going to be mounting my ISOs. Most of the time the ISOs are stored on C drive ISOs. Again, this is because of the lab environment that we have. I'm going to be selecting Server 2012 R2. I'm going to be using standard. I'm not going to do a serial key, and I'm going to provide a password. And it's going to give me a prompt because, again, I didn't do a serial, and that is okay. For the first server, I'm going to be calling it RWDC01. And go ahead and make sure that you're storing the VMs in the appropriate location. And again, for my environment, I am creating them in a VMs folder for a MOAC 7412 course. And this is going to be my RWDC01 machine. That way I can make sure I'm putting all my VMs together. I'm going to do all of my MOAC servers in that folder. That way I can keep them nice and organized. Storage is going to be okay at 16. I'm going to customize the hardware because I want to make sure that I at least have 2 gigs of RAM, and I do, and that should be sufficient for now. Actually, I take that back. I want to add a second network card. And right now, that's fine. But that way we have 2 network adapters. And that should be good. I'm going to go ahead and finish and let the installation pick up. Again, I'm choosing the majority of the default options, at least for our base installation. The actual installation, at least if you have a decent machine being installed on SSDs, we're not taking very long, normally about 5 to 10 minutes. So it didn't take too terribly long. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to log into my machine. And this is my domain controller. I'm going to go ahead and preset up my other 3 machines. And again, initially they're all just basic installations. They're all going to be identical. Okay, so I went ahead and I installed all 4 of my servers, just basic configuration, just like the first one. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab all of them. I'm just going to put them up in my MOAC folder. Server 1, 2, our domain controller, and our storage server. I want to organize these a little bit better, just so it's going to be our domain controller, our server 1, server 2, and storage. I want to do our domain controller first. The first thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that I have a password for my local administrator. So I want to manage another account, go over to my administrator, and I want to create a password. Keep in mind you cannot install Active Directory if the local administrator does not have a password. I want to do one more thing before we install the roles. I want to set a static address on this server, and our environment, we're going to be using 192. Make sure number lock is on 192.168.1, and we're doing .50. 255.255.255.0 is an appropriate subnet mask, and because this is going to be our DNS server as well, I'm going to use a loopback address. One last thing before we get too far forward is the server name is going to be off. Also, IE Enhanced Security is on. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the IE Enhanced Security. I'm also going to change my server name. And I want this RWDC01. And I'm going to go ahead and restart my VM. You want to do some of this configuration beforehand because you may end up setting up Active Directory, and if it's the wrong server name, you can sometimes rename your server. It just, Active Directory gets very wonky if you try changing server names after it's been installed, especially if it's the primary domain controller. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and log back in. So I'm going to be adding a new role. So that's my server. It's showing my appropriate address. Oh, is it? It should be .50, not .20. Oh, I fat fingered that. I meant 50. Okay, so we're back on the dashboard. I want to add roles and features. I'm going to go ahead and ignore the first begin page. I want a role-based role. I want it to go on this server. You'll notice the actual address is not changed. So how we fix that is we disable the interface. We bring the interface back online. That refreshes the address. .50, so we're good there now. You'll notice that's still showing .20. I'm going to start over. Oh, still showing .20. It will eventually correct itself. But that is the name of our server. That's what we want. We're installing Active Directory domain services. We're doing all of the appropriate features. We could also install DNS at the same time, but we're not going to. We're going to go through our Active Directory and let Active Directory set it up for us. And right now, that's it. I'm going to restart if necessary. Yes. And I'm going to install. Okay, our installation only took a second. Now that it's installed, you're going to notice we now have a flag going on. That's because even though it's installed, we need to promote this server to a domain controller. And so we're going to create a new forest, and we're going to call our forest student.local. It will verify that student.local is nowhere to be found, and that's okay. Even though we didn't install DNS server earlier, because it's not installed, it's going to preset it up for us. Choose our appropriate lab password. You may get a warning about the delegation of DNS server. That's okay. It will go back and verify the NetBIOS name. We have the option to look through our settings to verify that's what we want. It will preload our prereqs and start installing. Okay, so it's going to give us a few warnings. No red X's, so we're good. Normally, if we get a red X, that will prevent the installation. Normally, one of the more common red X's is local administrator password. And again, we have to make sure our administrator account has a password. So I have no red X's. I'm going to go click on install, and it will start the installation. The installation just took a few seconds, and it does want us to restart. So I'm going to go, let it restart. And now our Active Directory has been installed. One of the next things we're going to do is we're going to be setting up our dhcp and a softwares folder. Okay, now that our server has restarted and we've already set up our Active Directory, we need to go ahead and get back in, and we need to set up our dhcp. So we're going to add another role. Sometimes we have to be a little bit patient. Alright, so again, we're going to skip this beginning page. We're going to be installing a world base role. That's our server, and that's right. We're going to be installing the dhcp server. And right now, that's pretty much it. We're going to leave all the features alone. And we're going to be configuring dhcp here in a minute and install. dhcp server is pretty straightforward and should take only a second or two to install. Once we get rid of that, we are actually going to go ahead and configure our dhcp address, because we want to do a few things with it. We want to be able to set up a range, and that's actually the big thing. So let's go ahead and open up our dhcp console. So this right here is not our dhcp console, but we do need to make sure that in dhcp that this is taken care of. So we're going to click on more. Pretty much with this, it's just the initial dhcp configuration, and that is if it's authorized or not. We need to provide credentials, but you'll notice the user that I'm using, it won't let me do it under that user. That's because I'm not an administrator. So I'm going to go ahead and change over, and we're going to go to our administrator. Because my current user does not have the correct permissions, where administrator does. Done and done, we're good. Alright, so let's go ahead and hop over to our console. When it does anything about loading into a console, normally we're doing tools, and we're going to be accessing the tool from here. So even though here's dhcp and here's dhcp, they load different sections, and this will actually load the console. And here we are. Let's go ahead and expand out our domain controller. and we're going to expand out our IPv4. There is no current scope, so we actually want to create a new scope. So you can actually right click on it, new scope, and our scope is just going to be called main scope, and the starting address is going to be between 30 and 40. We are not going to be adding a exclusion or a delay. We're going to be leasing it for 8 hours. And yes, we're going to go ahead and configure certain options now. For example, our default gateway. We are not going to be using one, but normally you'd be setting a default gateway. For our parent domain, it's going to be student.local, and that is okay. For our server, we are looking at rwdc01.student.local. And let's go ahead and resolve this guy. We want the fully qualified domain there, not just the server name. Click resolve, and that should be the appropriate address, and it is. We're not going to be doing a Win server. And are we sure we want to activate our scope? Sure. And when we're done, finish. And there we have our main scope. Let's make sure that it's authorized. So how we do that is we actually right click on our server, and we can actually, if it's not authorized, it will have an authorized button here. Because it is already authorized, it says unauthorized. So it's already authorized. So our dhcp is done. We only have one last thing to do on our server, and that is to set up a share on C drive. So I'm going to go to computer, I'm going to go to C drive, I'm going to be creating a new folder, and we're going to call this software. I'm going to right click it, and I'm going to share my software with specific people. And I want to share it with everyone. I want everyone to be able to read and write to my share. And for our basic MOAC setup, we are done with our first server. So we can actually close out of, not turn off just yet, but go ahead and close out of our RWDC01 for now. Okay, so let's go ahead and hop over to our server 1. And first thing that we want to do is we want to change the IP address. And with this, we want to set it so that it's 192.168.1. Make sure number lock is on. 192.168.1.60. And the DNS needs to point to our domain controller, which should be .50. Alright, now that that's done, we actually want to go to local server. We want to verify the name. So our name is going to be server1, and we're actually going to change the domain to our student.local domain. It's going to ask you for credentials. As long as our RWDC01 is online and we have the appropriate address for DNS, this should work. We're going to log in with the administrator, and welcome to our domain. Normally we're looking at 3 errors. One error is a DNS issue, one error is a username or password issue, and normally the other option is just a welcome. So we're going to restart server 1 just to make sure that all of those settings take effect. We're going to go ahead and log in. And I want to make sure that we are now part of the student domain and that the name has been changed appropriately. So we are server 1 and we're on student.local, and this guy is good for now. So I'm actually going to go ahead and power down server 1. We're going to go ahead and hop over to server 2, and we're going to do the same setup. We're going to change its name to server 2, and we're going to join a student domain. It should actually not work because I did not change the IP address settings, so it should not know where student.local is. And that's the message. You could not be contacted. That's because the domain is missing. We fix that by putting in the correct IP information. And this one should be 19. Make sure number lock is enabled. 192.168.1.16. Oh, no, this one's 70. And make sure that the DNS is pointed back to our domain controller. And that's all we should need to do. So let's go ahead and rejoin our student domain. And enter our credentials for that. Admin, editor. And we're part of the student domain. And we're going to go ahead and restart server 2. And we should be good once it restarts. And while that is finishing up, last one that we have to work on is our storage server. We're going to verify server 2 is functioning before we go ahead and power it off. And it's showing server 2 on the student.local domain, so we're good there. Let's go ahead and shut it down. We're going to hop over to our storage server. First thing is let's go ahead and set up the IP information. And we are going to go with 192.1. Again, make sure the number lock is on. 1.80. And this one we're going to be, again, 192.168.1.50. DNS is always going to point back to our domain controller. With this one, we're going to set the name. We're going to call this storage 1. And we're going to make it join the student domain. Except we're going to add a little bit more information to this guy. Oh, make sure I write in the box. because this is going to act as a storage server for centralizing everything, we are actually going to be adding some iSCSI components to this server. So we're going to go ahead and restart it and then reconfigure it. Okay, now that it's restarted, we're going to go ahead and jump on it. We're going to be adding another role because this is going to act as our storage device. So we're going to be adding a new role and feature. Again, our beginning page is always going to be there. We're going to be a role based on this server. And we actually are going to modify our file and storage service. So we're going to expand out next to it, and we're going to be installing this file and iSCSI service. But we're not all of it. We're going to be just looking at a few of them. We're going to be adding iSCSI target server and all of its sub-features, as well as the iSCSI storage provider, VDS and VSS. That way, this server is going to act as an iSCSI storage. And that's all. We're going to go ahead and install those two components. Alright, the actual installation only took a few minutes. But before we go any further, we need to restart it. When you install the iSCSI portion, it won't prompt you to restart, but it's good practice to actually restart it. Okay, now that we restarted, we're going to go jump back in. And we are actually going to be waiting for file server, or for server manager to finish connecting and whatnot. And once we are, we're going to navigate the file and storage service. We're going to navigate to iSCSI. And you're going to notice there is no iSCSI virtual disk, so we're going to start a new iSCSI virtual disk. I've always noticed it starts down here. We need to make it a little higher, so we have that next option. So we're going to do the storage, and that's right. The name, we're going to call it shared disk. You could give it a description if need be. We're going to make this 8 gigs. And we're going to go ahead and leave our default options. And hit next. We could assign it to an existing iSCSI target, but we don't have any targets just yet. And our target, we're going to call cluster servers. Cluster servers. Now we're going to add both our servers in. So we're going to enter a value. We're not entering in an IQN or a DNS or a MAC. We're going to go with just IP address. And we're going to input the IP address for server 1 and server 2. That way, our iSCSI connectors should be able to connect to our 2 servers. We could enable CHAP or reverse CHAP, but we're not going to. We're going to leave all that default. And this is our overview, and that's all correct. So we're going to go ahead and create it. The actual creation of the iSCSI disks should not take very long. And here we are. Now that that's connected, we're going to go ahead and click on task, and we're going to create another iSCSI virtual disk. And we're going to call this one storage 1. Oh, I take that back. Node. We're going to be calling this one quorum disk. We're going to have it 2 gigs. We already have an existing iSCSI target that's pre-set up for our addresses, so we can go ahead and choose that one. And you're going to notice how easy it was the second time around for iSCSI setup. So that creates 2 disks, one for shared, one for quorum. We have one more to go, and we're going to call this storage 1. So let's create a new one. We want to call this storage 1, 5 gigs, selecting back our cluster server, verifying that's all the correct information, and we're creating a third iSCSI connector. We're going to repeat the same step 2 more times because we want storage 2 and storage 3. Storage 2, 5 gigs. We're going to do one more for storage 3. 5 gigs. Notice our virtual disks aren't really connected just yet, but those are going to be eventually connected. And let's go ahead and power off our VM. Okay, now that our machine is powered off, we're going to go ahead and edit our storage machine because we want to add 3 hard drives for 5 gigs each. And we're going to call this scuzzy disk 1. We're going to do the same thing. Another 5 gigs. And we're going to call this scuzzy disk 2. One more time. Again, 5 gigs. We're going to call this scuzzy disk 3. And that way it has all 3 of our disks. And that is at least our initial lab setup for our MOAC 7412 exam. Again, this is just the lab portion.